Aethelflaed, Lady of the Mercians. Aethelflaed was the daughter of King Alfred the Great of Wessex and became Queen of Mercia following the death of her husband Aethelred II, Lord of the Mercians. She is best known as the Lady of the Mercians who defeated the Vikings and established English rule, which would be consolidated by her brother Edward the Elder and lay the foundation for the reign of the first recognized English king, Aethelstan, who was king of the Anglo-Saxons 924 to 927 CE and king of the English 927 to 939 CE. Aethelstan is recognized by later historians as a pivotal figure in British history for his achievements in defeating the last of the Viking strongholds, centralizing the government, and establishing Britain as a potent force in European politics. It is unlikely, however, that he would have been able to accomplish what he did were it not for the influence of Aethelflaed of Mercia. Her reign was so effective that she would eclipse those of contemporaries such as her brother Edward the Elder in Wessex and, in her own time, she seems to have been more widely respected than even her famous father. Aethelflaed continued the policies initiated by Alfred in accord with Aethelred but, after her husband's death, ruled on her own as she orchestrated the policies and practices which resulted in diminishing the power of the Danes in Britain and allowed for the unification of the land under Edward and later Aethelstan. Nothing is known of Aethelflaed's youth, and she only enters the pages of history at the age of 15 or 16 when she was married to Aethelred. Her probable date of birth is 870 or 871 CE based on the approximate date of her marriage. Her name most likely means, overflowing with nobility according to scholar Joanna Arman, 32. Ethel means noble but the meaning of flayed, again according to Arman, is unclear but could mean something like flood or something flowing over. 32. Her name has also been translated as noble beauty. Aethelflaed's mother was Ealhswith, a noblewoman of Mercia. Ealhswith came from a long line of Mercian nobles just as Aethelflaed's father, Alfred, was descended from the royalty of Wessex. Sources regularly cite Aethelflaed as Alfred's oldest daughter but it is unknown whether she was also his oldest child. Her brother, Edward, appears to have been younger than she was. There can be little doubt, however, that Alfred's children were brought up in an atmosphere of piety, scholarship, and devotion to family and country, which were all defining characteristics of the king. Arman notes how young women who dedicated themselves to the church and renounced the world were provided with a good education, but that, there are allusions to all of Alfred's 5 children, including his 2 daughters who did not go into the church, having enjoyed an education. 74. In the same way that her brother Edward was provided with a tutor, so too may Aethelflaed have been. It is apparent from her later rule and court life that she was highly educated and cultured. It is unlikely, however, that Alfred himself would have spent much time with his daughter as he was occupied throughout her childhood fending off Viking incursions into Wessex. The Vikings had first appeared in Britain in 793 CE when they landed on the coast and sacked the priory of Lindisfarne, slaughtering the monks and carrying off anything of value. From that time on, Britain was at the mercy of these raiders from the sea who struck without warning, slaughtered without discrimination, and plundered at will. By the time Alfred was a prince and military commander, c. 865 CE, these raids had transformed into full-scale invasions under the leadership of skilled warriors like Halfdane, 865 to 877 CE, and his brother Ivar the Boneless, c. 870 CE. These 2 commanders led the massive invasion of the Great Army in 865 CE which proved itself invincible, defeating every force thrown against it, and conquering every region they entered. Alfred and his brother, Aethelred of Wessex, are 865 to 871 CE, met the Vikings in battle at Reading and were defeated, but at the Battle of Ashdown in January of 871 CE their combined forces drove the Vikings from the field and proved Alfred's skill in battle. His victory did nothing to halt the Viking incursions, however, and he was afterwards defeated and driven into hiding. It is unknown whether Aethelflaed would have accompanied her father into exile. The sources, which only focus on the king and not on his family, only note that Alfred traveled in secret, and often disguised, with a small company of men. He was forced into this position by a Viking raid on Chippenham led by the Viking warlord Guthrum, died c. 890 CE, in 878 CE, which caught him and his army completely by surprise. Alfred and his family were at Chippenham celebrating Christmas and the attack was launched and, since anyone who did not manage to escape was killed or enslaved, it is more than probable that Alfred took his family with him when he fled. After a few months in hiding and conducting guerrilla raids on Viking settlements, Alfred was able to mobilize a sizable force and defeated the Vikings under Guthrum at the Battle of Edington in May 878 CE. This was the decisive engagement which gave Alfred the power to finally dictate terms to his opponents who, thus far into his reign, had consistently held the upper hand. Guthrum and 30 of his chieftains were baptized as Christians as part of the treaty, and they swore not to raise arms against Wessex again. Although the Vikings kept their word and stayed clear of Wessex, the treaty in no way stipulated that they had to leave Britain, and so they stayed and fortified previously established settlements in Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia. In 886 CE Alfred drove the Vikings from London and secured it and, shortly afterwards, arranged the marriage between his eldest daughter and the king of Mercia, Aethelred. Although it is sometimes claimed that Aethelflaed's marriage was arranged to secure an alliance between Wessex and Mercia, this is inaccurate. The two regions were already allied by the marriage of Alfred and Ealhswith decades before, and Aethelred had already accepted Alfred as his lord prior to 886 CE. A more accurate understanding of the marriage is that it was a display of unity which not only renewed each region's commitment to the other but made a clear statement of strength to the Vikings. Aethelred was at least 10 years older than Aethelflaed and had probably been betrothed to her early on. He had accepted Alfred as his overlord as early as 883 CE following Alfred's victory at Edington. Aethelred is referred to as a great Christian warrior who fought against the heathen Vikings, but there is no record of how he became king of Mercia. However it happened, he had control of the region by the 880 CE and was a powerful warlord at the time of the marriage. Aethelred and Aethelflaed began their reign from the city of Gloucester, not far from Wessex, and close to her family's estates. Even though later romantic traditions would come to characterize their union as a loveless marriage of convenience, there is no evidence for this claim. They had one daughter, Elfwin, who is first named on a land charter in 903 CE but was not old enough to sign it as a legal witness. She may have been born shortly after the marriage, but her birth date is unknown. William of Malmesbury, writing much later, claims that the birth of Elfwin almost killed Aethelflaed, and she took measures to make sure she had no more children. Aethelred and Aethelflaed worked in accord with Alfred of Wessex and mirrored his Burghouse system of defense, in which fortified towns could easily be reinforced by others within a day's march, as well as his educational policies. Following Alfred's lead, they invited men of learning from other countries to Mercia to teach their clerics Latin and further other educational goals. They also restored, improved, and rebuilt cities and towns which had been damaged or destroyed during the Viking Wars. The peace Alfred had won from the Vikings at Edington and then at London, however, were only temporary respites in the struggle between the people of Britain and the Norse invaders. Although the period afterwards was somewhat less stressful, Viking raids and difficulties between Viking settlers and others continued, and in 892 CE the situation worsened and a new host of Viking raiders arrived under the leadership of the Viking raider Hastin, also given as Hastin. Alfred and Aethelred fought repeated engagements against Hastin from 892 CE until Hastin disappears from history in 896 CE. He may have been killed in battle, but it seems this would have been noted. Most likely he either left Britain or died of natural causes. King Alfred died in 899 CE and was succeeded by his son Edward. Edward sent his son, Aethelstan, to the Mercian court in 900 CE to be raised by Aethelred and Aethelflaed alongside their daughter. Aethelstan would remain in Mercia throughout his younger years, educated at the court with his cousin Elfwin, and would later gain military experience on campaigns with Aethelred and then with Aethelflaed. The king and queen of Mercia were great patrons of the church and freely endowed different priories and churches with large sums of money. They sent a raiding party into hostile territory to retrieve the bones of Saint Oswald, the pious king of Northumbria who had founded the priory of Lindisfarne, and built a priory to house them at Gloucester. They would both be interred in this building, close by the relics of the saint, after their deaths. They were especially generous to the church at Worcester who, in return, agreed to pray for them and dedicate services, or at least psalms to their honor and for their continued health. In spite of these prayers, around 902 CE, Aethelred was stricken with a disease which seems to have incapacitated him. It would worsen over the next few years and, during this time, Aethelflaed effectively ruled alone. Sources from this period reference Aethelred's illness and make clear that Aethelflaed was the defining power in Mercia. The most famous story comes from the Irish annals and recounts how, in 907 CE, a Norwegian Viking named Ingemund came from Ireland with his troops to Aethelflaed, queen of the Saxons, for her husband Aethelred was sick at that time, asking for a place he could peacefully settle in. 170. She granted him lands near the city of Chester, but, after he had settled his people there, he noticed there were even more attractive areas around what he had been given. He then complained to the neighboring Danes and other Norwegians that he had been given too little when he deserved so much more and initiated a plan to take Chester by force. Aethelred is mentioned repeatedly throughout this story as being sick, very sick or sick and on the verge of death, 171 to 173. Messengers arrived at the court to tell the queen about Ingemund's plan and, even though Aethelred is cited as party to the response, it seems to have been Aethelflaed who prepared the battle plan that saved the city. She first gathered a large army, and then instructed the people of Chester on how to deploy the troops outside the city and fight with the gates open. Inside the city walls a much larger troop of cavalry would be stationed and, at a given point, the army outside should give way before the Vikings and retreat through the open gates where the troop of horse would be unleashed on the invaders. At the same time, Aethelflaed wrote to the Irish who had allied themselves with Ingemund and appealed to them as friends who had been wronged by a common enemy. She asked them why they were fighting in the interests of those who had invaded their own country against her people who had never done them any wrong, and further suggested the Irish chiefs should ask the Vikings what lands and goods were promised them for risking their lives in a cause not their own. Her letter was effective and, either just before or during the battle, the Irish switched sides. The defense of Chester worked almost as Aethelflaed had planned. The defenders retreated and the cavalry massacred the Vikings who followed them. The attackers refused to give up, however, and the battle went on as the people of Chester defended the city by pouring boiling hot beer down on the Vikings from the walls. When the Vikings defended themselves with shields, the defenders hurled down the hives of honey bees while continuing to scald the Vikings with beer until the attack was called off and the city was saved.